Hey everybody, it's Chris with Xano, and today I'm super excited to walk you through our Airtable import feature. I know we have a lot of you that are bringing your data from Airtable to Xano, so today I want to walk you through that process. I'm going to show you how it works, and I'm also going to show you how you can transform and manipulate that data after your import is complete. So let's dive in. We'll take a look at our Airtable base, and we will see how this import works. Okay, so taking a look at my Airtable database, you can see I have 4 tables here, and I'm using several different field types, including dates. We have attachments in this companies table, and in my dates table, we're using table references. And then in my customers table, I have an email field with some purposefully problematic data because I want to show you how you can work through these records and transform them automatically inside Xano. If you are brand new to Xano and you're just getting started, you will be given the opportunity to import your data during our Jumpstart wizard. So this is your initial onboarding, and you can see here I'm going to select that I'm importing data from Airtable. And we can click Get Started, and we can give our workspace a name. So I will call this Airtable Import Demo. And you can see I have a big Import from Airtable button right here. So I can click that. And now we are asked what our Airtable API key is. So let me show you how to get that from Airtable. So to get your Airtable API key, we're going to click on the upper right-hand corner here. We're going to click our account, and we will just click Account in the dropdown. And we have a button right here that just says Generate API Key. So we can click this, and we can copy this key and just paste it right over to Xano and click Continue. And now we are given an option to choose which base we want to import. So we will select our Airtable demo. And we are also given the option to choose the tables that we want to import and the views of those tables. So let's say, as an example, on my users table, I have a view that only lists users with a start date after January 1st of 1970. And that is the only data that I want to live in my Xano database. I can easily select that view and only have that data imported. We're also given an option down here at the bottom to download and import attachments. So I am going to check that box because we do have attachments in our Airtable database. And we'll click continue and we will hit finish. And so now we are in our Airtable import demo workspace. And down in the lower left-hand corner, we have a processing notification, and you can see our Airtable import is processing and it is currently fetching our tables. So we will come back once this is complete. Okay, so now we can see in this banner up at the top, it says your import is complete. Update Xano to see the new data, and we can click Update Xano. And let's head to our database and check out our imported data. So we have 4 tables here. We have our companies, customers, dates, and users. Let's take a look at the users table. So you can see here we have all of the data from our users table that has been imported here into Xano, including our attachments, which is really cool. And if we go back, we can take a look at our companies table. And this table had some relational data from Airtable that you can see Xano has imported and created that reference to our users table for us. So we don't have to do anything else here. We can check our dates table and we have the same situation here. However, this is the table that had our formula cell, which you can see has been imported as text. So unfortunately, we are going to have to do some transformation here, and we're also going to have to employ either a function or a task to continue to maintain this formula, which we'll show you in just a second. And then finally, we can take a look at our customers table, which also has all of the data from our Airtable base. Very cool. So the next thing I want to show you is while we were able to import our tables, just setting up our new workspace in Xano, what if I want to import a table from Airtable after I've already been working in Xano? We can see in our database view here, I can just go right up here in the corner to this Add Table option, and I can click Import, and then I can select Airtable. Xano has remembered my Airtable API key, so I can just click Next. And then we are given an option to, again, select our base and then select the tables that we want to import. For this example, I want to import my dates table. And we are also, again, given the option to download and import attachments. We are given the option to map Airtable collaborators to a table with an email field. So, what does this mean? This means that we have referenced data in our dates table in Airtable. So Xano is asking us, okay, which table does this actually map to? And in this case, it looks like it's going to be our users table. So let's actually make sure to select the users table right here. And then we have the option to also add basic CRUD endpoints. CRUD endpoints stands for create, read, update, and delete. So Xano can actually pre-build for us API endpoints to perform those basic operations on this new table that we're importing. For this example, I'm not actually going to need those right now, so I'm going to uncheck that box and we will just click import. And this import will just take a few moments to start and we will be notified once it has completed. Now, obviously, one of the biggest advantages to importing your data from Airtable to Xano is the ability to transform and manipulate this data after the import. So let's say, as an example, I want to take this customers table and I want to create a new field that has the first name and last name put together in a single field. So I'm going to go over here to the right and I'm going to click this plus sign here to add a new column to my customers table. This is just going to be a text field, and I'm going to call this full name, and we will save that. So now we can add an API endpoint here. I'm going to start from scratch. I'm going to say create full names is what I'm going to call this, and we'll click save. And so now we just have an empty Xano function stack. So let's go ahead and we are going to add our first step, which is going to be to query the data inside of that database table. So I'm going to go up here to database requests, and I'm going to query all the records from my customers table. So what this is going to do is this is going to get all of the records from my customers table, and it's going to store those records in a variable, and that variable is called customers underscore one. Let's make this a little bit easier to understand. I can change the name of this variable to whatever I would like. So I'm going to call this customer data, and we will click save. And now I'm going to update my response. The response is just what data does this API endpoint return once we've finished execution. So let's say I want to just look at that customer data after the query. We can go ahead and run and debug this. And you can see we are returned the data from our customers table. We have that first name and last name field, and we can see our empty full name field right here as well. So now to combine the first and last name into a single field, we are going to need to loop through each of these records to update them. So that's going to be a for each loop, which I will add right here. In the for each loop, the first thing we're asked is what data are we looping through? And for that, that is going to be our customer data. That's the variable that all those records are being stored in. So that is the data that we are going to loop through one at a time to actually modify that record. Now, when I'm building a loop, the first thing I like to do is add a stop and debug to this loop. Stop and debug is a function that allows you to halt execution of your Xano function stack and look at the output of one or more variables. So, what I want to do here is I want to look at the contents of this variable called item. Item is the variable that the loop uses to store a single record at a time that it is iterating through. So that will give me an idea of the structure that I'm working with in the rest of this loop. So let's go ahead and add our stop and debug. And the variable that I want to take a look at is item. And what item will contain is just the contents of the first record that the loop is iterating through. And what I'm going to do here before I leave this screen is I'm going to click this copy button here. So this is going to copy this result to my clipboard, and it's going to make things a little bit easier for me in terms of constructing the rest of this function stack. So I will copy this. The next step I'm going to add to my loop is just an edit record step. And that is also under database operations. And I'm going to edit a record in my customers table. The first thing that the edit record step asks is what is the ID of the record that we're editing? Now, when you're editing a record, you don't have to use the ID. You can use any field in the database table to determine which record we're going to edit. For this example, I'm just going to use ID. And then we're asked what is the value? So what is the actual ID of the record that we want to edit? And we can get that from the item variable because that item variable contains the record that we're currently iterating through. We can just get the ID right out of there. Now, the reason that I copied the result a little bit earlier when we used the stop and debug is I can hover over item and I can click subpath right here and I can actually paste this result in here and click define. And what this gives me is just a super seamless point and click interface to find the exact field that I'm trying to reference. In this case, that is ID. Now we need to define the fields of the record that we're actually editing. The only field that we want to change here is full name. So I'm going to click this little eye icon right here, and that is going to enable that field for editing. So how do we actually populate the full name field? There's a couple of different ways you can do this, but this is the way that I normally like to go about it. In this case, I'm going to use a filter called sprintf. Sprintf allows me to replace text inside of another value. So to do that, I first need to define the text that I want to replace. And we do that with a %s. The %s just tells the sprintf filter, this is the text I want you to replace. So we're doing 2% s's because we have a first name and a last name, and this will also allow me to include the space in between those two values. So now that we have our 2% s values, we can click add filter, and we want to add sprintf, formats text with variable substitution. And now we need to specify some arguments. The arguments are just the data that we're actually replacing those %s values with. So that is going to again come from item. I'm going to again use subpath to quickly dial down to that value for my first name and my last name, just like that. So now that we've constructed our full name value, we can go ahead and save this. And again, because I'm building a loop, I don't want to run through all 1,000 iterations before I know whether or not it works. I want to again utilize stop and debug for this. So I'm going to move stop and debug below this edit record step, and I'm just going to change the value that the stop and debug returns. So because the edit record is outputting to a variable called customers1, that is the variable that I'm going to tell stop and debug to show me the contents of. So now if we run this again, we can see the contents of our first edited record, and we can see that this has constructed the full name just like we expect. So with that being said, we know that this works, and now we can remove our stop and debug. I just used the little eye icon to temporarily disable that, and we can run and debug through our entire loop. All right, so our loop has completed. Now, if we look at the results, you can see none of these full names are actually populated. What's going on there? Well, in our response, we're still returning the contents of customer data, which is just a query before any editing has happened. So we can just go right back into our database right here, and we can scroll over and we can see that our full name field has been populated and everything looks great. Now that was just a one-time transformation. We're not necessarily going to need to do that again. But what if we have a transformation that we need to continually have take place? For example, the formula field in our dates table. Let's take a look and see how we would handle that. So let's think about the formula that we have set up in our Airtable base. This is a formula that just calculates the amount of time since a user's start date. We also want to think about when do we actually need this data and when do we need that calculation to take place. Do we really only need it when we query that user data? Or is that something that we want to make sure is always up to date in our actual database? For this example, I'm going to show you how you can utilize a background task to make sure that that data is always up to date. So let's take a look over here on the left-hand side in Xano. We can go to our tasks. Our background tasks are essentially scheduled jobs that we can have run as often as we want to update this data. So we can add a new task here, and let's just call this calculate time. Okay, so taking a look at our background task, let's go ahead and start populating our function stack. The first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to query all of the records in our dates table. This is because we are only maintaining this information for certain users, so it makes the most sense to start with our dates table so we can only edit those records. So after that, we need to set up a for each loop. The for each loop is going to allow us to iterate through these dates records one at a time so we can update that seconds employed value. So let's go ahead and set up our loop, and then we are going to use a stop and debug once again to help us with the further construction of that loop. So let's take a look at the item variable, which is the variable that the loop is using to iterate through these records. Okay, so we have our item variable contents here. So let's go ahead and copy this, and we will use this to continue constructing our loop. So what do we have in this data? We have the ID of the record that we're looking at in the dates table. We have a created at timestamp, which we won't be using here. We have the ID of the user that this record belongs to, and then finally we have our seconds employed value. So the next thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to find out the user's start date. So we can do that by, again, using a database request. This one is going to be a get record. We're going to get this record from the user table. And now we just need to specify the ID of the record to get, and that is going to come from the item variable. Again, we're going to use the subpath to quickly narrow down to the ID of the user whose record we're editing. And just to make sure that makes sense, we are going to use stop and debug to take a look at the output of this get record, which will be of the user whose date record we are currently taking a look at. And you can see we have the start date right here. Now, this may look a little weird. Xano stores timestamps in a Unix epoch format, so that is the number of seconds that have passed since January 1st, 1970. So that is why this is not in a what you would expect as a normal date format, but this is exactly what we need to continue with our calculation. So how do we actually then calculate this data? I'm going to go ahead and copy this result, and I'm going to add a new step to my for each loop, and I'm going to create a variable, and I'm just going to call this calculation. For our calculation, the value that we're going to start with is just going to be now. And you can see that this changed to a type of timestamp. So one of the variables that Xano maintains and makes available to you is called now, which just contains a current timestamp. So we'll go ahead and use that. And now we're going to add a filter, which is going to be subtract. And all we need to do here is subtract the timestamp of our start date. And we are getting that again from users_1. We will use our subpath, and we will dial down right to that start date value. So let's go ahead and update this. And we will move our stop and debug so we can make sure that that calculation is giving us what we need there. So you can see I have been given a value. This is actually going to be in milliseconds. So to take this from milliseconds to seconds, we just go ahead and divide this by 1000. And we can go ahead and check that calculation. So there is our number of seconds. And finally, we can edit the record in the dates table. So let's go ahead and add that final step to our loop. So that's going to be edit record. So we're editing the record from our dates database table. Our ID is going to come from item because, again, item is the current dates record that we're iterating through. So that's going to be item.id. And then we're just going to update seconds employed with the value of our calculation. Simple as that. So let's go ahead and save this. We will remove our stop and debug. And now finally, we can go ahead and run this once just to give us our most up-to-date information. You can see that we don't have our results because, again, background tasks don't really have results. They're just meant to run in the background as often as you need to. And that's kind of the most important piece of this, right? So I will show you how to actually enable this as a repeating task. So you can see we have a banner here that says this task is currently inactive. We can click this green button to enable the task. And we can add some timing to this task, which just says how often does this run. So we can have it run once, and we can, of course, set the specific date and time for that. But we can also then repeat it as often as every 5 seconds if we want to, depending on your Xano plan. So you definitely have a lot of flexibility here in terms of how often you want your task to run. And again, the goal here is to essentially simulate and replace our formula cell that we had in Airtable. Now, I did mention there are a couple of different ways you can go about this. I won't necessarily go into a ton of detail on them, but let's say, as an example, you don't need this data to be maintained in the database table, but maybe when you query your user records, you want this to be up to date. The functionality would look almost exactly the same, it just wouldn't live in the background task, but it would live in the API endpoint that you use to call that data. Thanks so much for watching. I really hope this gives you an idea of how to use our Airtable import feature and also how to transform and manipulate that data after your import is complete. I understand that there is a lot of nuance to this and everybody's data set is different, so please don't be afraid to head down to the comments and leave us any questions you may have. You can also reach out to us via support chat inside Xano or on the Xano community. Thanks again for watching, and we will see you in the next one.